Hello, my name is Steve Semken. I'm a professor of geology and education in the School of Earth and Space Exploration at Arizona State University. And I'd like to talk with you briefly about place-based teaching and learning. I've been practicing and also doing research on place-based teaching and learning for more than 30 years. And this next slide shows where it all started. My experience with place-based teaching started when I was teaching and working with the Diné people on the Navajo Nation in northern Arizona and northwest New Mexico. And I learned that the philosophy of place-based education essentially emerged from the instructional educational philosophies of indigenous people. Place-based education is teaching and learning that is situated in place. I'll talk more about place itself in just a moment, but place-based education is distinguished by the way it focuses on and draws on the natural and cultural attributes of places, and that duality of nature and culture. I emphasize it here because that's really essential to what place-based education is about. And drawing on these attributes, the intention is to offer greater context and relevance to learners. I put two quotes up here that frame the discussion nicely, I think. The first is by the late Dudley Patterson, who was an elder of the Nde, or Western Apache people, and he put it quite succinctly. He said, wisdom sits in places. We have to go to places in order to learn. Greg Smith, a faculty member at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and a great scholar of place-based education, the way he put it is that place-based education is what happened before schools were created. So let's now talk briefly about place. There are many, many different definitions for that term. We use place as a noun and a verb all the time, but I take my cue from geographers, and geographers define place as any location that we people, human beings, give meaning to by means of experiences in that place. And the thing is, the place can be real, like Grand Canyon. It can be remote, like an exoplanet that we haven't visited yet. It can be virtual, like a virtual field trip online, or even imaginary, like the Hogwarts School in the Harry Potter series. It's also important to note that there's really no specific size or scale that a place has to be, as long as it is some location that we find meaningful. So it could be something as small as a favorite rocking chair where we experience, we read or we experience the world from there, or a schoolyard, or a city, or even the planet Earth itself. Any size or scale will work. What I like to tell my students is to think about places as the cultural equivalent of landforms, meaning like mesas or canyons or rivers or valleys here in the Southwest, mountains, beaches, elsewhere. There's this natural landscape all around the planet, okay, made of natural features that are created by geological and biological and hydrological processes. But human beings have essentially permeated that natural landscape. There really isn't anywhere on Earth that we haven't either been or looked at or thought about. And so we create what we can think of as a cultural landscape that is interwoven with the natural landscape. And places are what populate that cultural landscape. In this illustration here, this is a tourist map from the 1950s that I think shows what I'm talking about here. It shows places, names of places that are shown by the signs, and they're very richly interwoven with the natural landscape of southern Arizona. Place is absolutely relevant to teaching science and to learning science. And that's simply because when we study and teach about nature, we have to do that in and by means of places. The very act of studying nature, we create places in nature. Edward Casey, who's a philosopher of place, professor at Stony Brook University in New York, he put it this way: our access to space and time is how they happen in a given place. And places have many, many different meanings. I mean, meanings can be historical, they can be spiritual, they can be economic, they can be aesthetic, and they can also be scientific. So when we study places, we accrue scientific knowledge, and that becomes part of the many, many different kinds of meanings that accrue to places. And so the very act of doing science, the scientific enterprise, does contribute to placemaking. For example, on the moon, we established a place on the moon that we call Tranquility Base, and the reason for doing that was primarily for exploration and for science. But it's also important to note that we have personal relationships to places, and I'll talk about that more in just a moment. But our relationship to place, epitomized here by this shot of a Native Hawaiian field course. It was a course that was taught by Native Hawaiian scholars for Native Hawaiian teachers, and it resonated with their strong connection to their native home island. Our relationship to place influences how they investigate places, how we investigate places, how we learn from them, we understand them, and we teach in and about them. So I hope I've convinced you here that the whole idea of place really can't be separated from science teaching. So you can do an experiment. I do this a lot with my students, or I do this with pre-service teachers with whom I'm working, and that is to ask them how they relate to place. And one little exercise is you can have somebody think about a place that is meaningful to them, then think about what makes it meaningful, and then think about how they feel when they think about this place. And then they can respond to those prompts by describing this place in writing, or they can portray the place in a sketch and label the elements that they put in the sketch, or they can just simply talk about it. But it's a great exercise to get people thinking about not only the idea of place, but how you connect to places, meaning, and also personal attachments. And that brings me to the next point, and that is that as we make meaning in places, we make intellectual connections. We find meaning, scientific meaning or historical meaning, but we also make emotional connections to places. As we imbue places with diverse meanings, it is in the nature of human beings to form attachments to places that mean something to us, or it can even be a negative attachment. If it's a place that you don't like, that you're averse to, that's still an emotional attachment. It's just in the other direction. And geographers and environmental psychologists have identified this construct that we call the sense of place. And the sense of place is just simply the combination of all the meanings and all the attachments that we as individuals or collectively in groups affix to a given place. So the sense of place really does render something that you might think is kind of vague and intangible. You say, well, how in the world do we relate to places? Well, the sense of place is something that actually makes that connection not only tangible, but even measurable. And so again, the sense of place is defined as the set of all meanings and attachments that are held by an individual or a group for any given place. This is part of the research we've been doing for a number of years as we've explored this idea of sense of place as a learning outcome of place-based education that we can teach. We can actually encourage our students to reinforce and strengthen their own sense of place, and then we can assess how well we've done both quantitatively using things like surveys on the left. There are a number of published, validated surveys that get at the components of place attachment and place meaning that our students or teachers might have. We can also do it by a number of qualitative or observational methods where we can actually observe how students learn in place, whether it's in the field, whether it's in a virtual environment, or whether it's learning about a place when they're working together in a classroom. So we can also do that by observation. We can interview students and teachers. We can ask them, well, now that you've taken this class, how do you feel about this place? How has your connection to this place changed? Hopefully it's strengthened. And then finally, we can also look at things that students produce, like sketches and essays and homework assignments, and we can see how their relationship to place changes and hopefully broadens and becomes enriched as they engage with the scientific, with the natural, and also with the cultural aspects of the places they study. See, the thing is that there are many different outcomes we can have for place-based education, and many of them are very common to other ways of teaching and learning, like content knowledge or attitudes towards science or ability to perform certain skills. But what distinguishes place-based education from all these other methods is this idea of sense of place, where it's actually a measurable learning outcome that we can teach and assess. Now, we're very interested, of course, now in how this works in virtual learning environments. I think it's easy to see that when we teach students on the ground in a real place physically, we can easily see how they connect to that place. But what about in the virtual learning environment, online, for example, or in a virtual field trip? And it turns out that there is a virtual sense of place as well. And we can build sense of place in our students, whether we teach them on the ground physically, in place, or in virtual environments. And this chart shows ways we can do it. We can build students' place attachment by teaching with authentic experiences on the ground, or we can mimic familiar settings as closely as possible in the virtual environment. We can use different teaching technologies and diversify learning activities, and above all, make sure that at least some of the learning tasks require students to collaborate. Most importantly, though, I think is we as instructors have to model strong place attachment. We show that passion we have for the places we use in teaching and how we actually identify with them. Place meaning, same thing. We can integrate inquiry into both the natural and cultural attributes, the natural and cultural meanings of the place. And also, I think very important is to teach ideas and practices for resilience and sustainability in the place. In other words, if students are really getting to become familiar with a place, intimate with a place, we want them to think and behave in ways that promote the natural and cultural resilience and sustainability of those places. So a while back, people asked me, well, if you're getting started in this idea of place-based teaching, how might you do it? And we did some studies of various practices of place-based education in many, many different settings and environments. We essentially did what we call a meta-analysis. And we found that there seemed to be 5 main characteristics of place-based education. When we had really authentic and really well-developed place-based education, they all had these 5 characteristics in common. And so we like to think of these as design elements for place-based teaching. If you are setting out to teach in a place-based way, look at these 5 elements and see how you might be able to adopt some or maybe even all of them in your teaching. So the first one, again, is to focus the content. Since this is a science, say we're teaching science, we want to focus our content on the natural attributes of the place under study, but we also want to bring in cultural attributes of the place. Maybe it has significance to indigenous people. Maybe there is knowledge that indigenous people have, traditional ecological knowledge, which relates directly to the place. But integrating these cultural attributes allows us to provide context and relevance. Now, I would say if we were teaching maybe a social science or humanities course, we might flip those 2 around. The content would be the cultural attributes and the context would be the natural attributes. Again, third one is to teach with authentic experiences in that place. Okay, if you can take them into the place, that's wonderful. Out into the field, out into the schoolyard, out into town. But it doesn't have to be on ground, right? It can also be in an environment that evokes that place. And here's where virtual learning environments come into play. The more authentically we can evoke real places in virtual environments, the more robustly we can teach with authentic experiences using those virtual environments. The fourth element is to teach ideas and practices for natural and cultural resilience and sustainability in the place under study, which I talked about just a moment ago. And then finally, we want to encourage students to form their own intellectual and emotional connections to place. In other words, enrich their senses of place. And we do that again by modeling not only the knowledge that we accrue in these places, but also our own personal passion for places, our own personal identification with these places. Students respond to modeling place attachment, modeling sense of place, and their own sense of place is likely to grow as a consequence. It's important to note, though, that you don't have to do all of these things all at once to teach in a place-based way, because place-based teaching is a continuum. Simply by adopting 1 or 2 or a couple of these design elements, you enter onto a continuum, which if you've adopted all of them, you get to a point where you come up with sort of a wholly place-based way of teaching. So on the left, we have an example where we just use textbook examples from instructive places. Like, for example, that's Devil's Tower in Wyoming. And if we're going to teach a class in igneous rocks, we might use that as an example of an igneous feature. But to go beyond that, we can say, well, the name of this place is, to many people, Devil's Tower, but to the indigenous people in this area, they refer to it as Bear Butte. And they had a story of its origin that involved a giant bear gouging those cracks, those columnar joints, into the side of that landform. So the important thing is, if you use these textbook examples, you want to add a little bit more knowledge just to show that these are not just examples of processes or features on the earth, but they're also places that have meaning to people. And we use that to teach knowledge and skills. And if we progress along that continuum, that flowing river, if you will, adding more and more design elements, we eventually get to a point where place itself becomes the subject. And now it's not really so much a particular subject, it's just place. And we're merging many, many different disciplines and the knowledge and skills that they have in order to know that place better. And in this kind of teaching, sense of place is definitely an authentic learning objective. So with this slide here, this is a rather busy and sort of stream of consciousness slide, but this is a graphic I put together, an infographic to show all of the ways that I teach in a place-based way when I teach about the Southwest United States in my geology classes. Along the bottom, we have the 5 design elements I've been talking about, and then radiating out from those elements are different ways that we can use those different elements. We can, in the case of the natural attributes, of course, we focus on the geology of the region we're studying, the Earth system processes, but then also the cultural landscapes. What are the traditional place names? What are the ethnogeological knowledges, the knowledges of indigenous people as to how the earth works in those areas? With the authentic experiences, we can do it in the field, we can do it virtually, we can do it in the community, bring in ideas about career experiences for students that are relevant to that place. As far as promoting environmentally and culturally sustainable practices and policies, well, we have cultural preservation, resource conservation, hazards mitigation, waste management, environmental remediation. All of these things are ways that we can act to help protect and preserve the places we use for teaching. And service learning, we can give back to the community through service learning. We can encourage our students to teach in schools or to give presentations. We can also work with cultural experts. Again, people who may have roots in a place going back centuries, if not millennia, and have knowledge of place that we don't have, that if they're willing to share with us. And then finally, we encourage students to develop their own sense of place primarily through creativity. They do final projects where they can sort of they can manifest their own sense of place in ways that are best for them. They can tell stories, they can do something as basic as writing a paper, or they can be really creative, like for example, the illustration of the pendant necklace you see there. That was a student I had who happened to be a jewelry artist. And so she created this wonderful pendant necklace based on copper in Arizona, where the entire piece of jewelry was made of copper and different copper minerals. And then she did a presentation on the properties of those minerals, which made them such wonderful gemstones. So this is how I do it in my classes, but your mileage may vary. You can do it pretty much any way you'd like to bring students together with place. And so I'm going to stop here and just say thank you very much. My website is below, and the email connection to me is through that too. So I have papers on there, and if you'd ever like to talk about sense of place or place-based teaching, feel free to reach out to me. Sorry I couldn't be with you today, but thank you for listening. Bye-bye.